Welcome, folks. Welcome to ThreatTraq, and today we're going to talk a little bit about our 2021 predictions. And first, Stan, let's talk with you a little bit here. I understand that the crime is getting big.
Oh, yeah, specifically cybercrime. And, I kind of related back to advanced persistent threats, which is a term we hear a lot over the past, many years. It used to be a term that was reserved for nation-state adversaries. But I think more these days, you can really apply that term to cybercrime, because cybercrime has become more advanced, more ambitious, I would say, and definitely persistent. It seems like it's a great source of revenue for criminals and fraudsters, and there's probably no sign of it abating anytime soon. So everything that we're seeing with malware and different fraud schemes, things that we're reading about, it kind of points in the direction that this is not a problem that's going away, and it's probably going to get bigger in a lot of ways. So this is something definitely that is always keeping me up. We've definitely seen adversaries getting more creative in their approaches. And if I just think about, I guess ransomware is an easy one to think about. So if you look back maybe 2-3 years ago, a lot of adversaries, they'd install malware in your computer, and right away you'd get ransomware on that PC. And that would be, you got on your desktop ransomware. But the situation has slightly changed. The adversaries kind of know that they can get a bigger payout if they dig in deeper into some of these networks. And I think there have been countless stories this year of different organizations becoming victims of ransomware schemes where their whole organization, not just a few computers, became victims of that. So there's just some examples of what has happened that kind of indicate that this problem is not going to go away. Again, it's going to be, like, I guess, campaigns against victims are going to become more bespoke, I think, where adversaries are going to get to know the organization that they're in. They're not going to take action right away, and they're going to, make bigger and bigger intrusions, and they're getting really good at it, actually, unfortunately.
Yeah, Stan, I think you're absolutely right about this, and I've observed very much the same way. And I think part of your comments here are probably going to be a good segue into my segment, where we're going to talk about extortion type attacks a little more generally. But I think, to your point, the criminal organizations have a very large pool of talent that they can bring to bear, and sharing, forums to be able to share their capabilities. And so it increases their level of sophistication, capabilities, the resources they can bring to bear. Nation states have a similar depth, but for a different reason. It's because they're investing money into specific individuals that they're developing that talent pool with. So whereas I think you made actually a good point. I tend to use the term relentless, that the criminal organizations tend to be more relentless because they are, let's say they're not inhibited by a political angle that would inhibit them from doing particular things. So long as they can get the money and remain relatively well protected from authorities, then they're going to continue to advance their activities. And so far, they've demonstrated certain opportunities for that. So, very good point.
So, Stan, I guess the question I would say is, do you think that the cybercrime is going to be, like you're saying, ransomware, but also, do you think the targets are going to increase or stay the same for things like PII or intellectual property, or is those also going to be more of these targeted for cybercrime as opposed to to the traditional nation state?
No, I think a lot of cyber criminals, they don't sit down always and like, hey, we're going to target this person. Like, I would think like nation state adversaries, that's kind of where they start. So for me, a lot of what they do is just targets of opportunity, really. So I think they're gonna, I think what we've seen this year, and we've seen this before, but it's just a larger scale each year, is they're always looking for vulnerabilities. Like there was this big F5 vulnerability earlier this year. And I think from the time that it was disclosed and discovered to the time that the first scanning happened, was like seconds, or it was instantaneous when they were able to take a report of a vulnerability and start scanning and compromising different organizations. So a lot of times, I think what they'll do is they'll continue doing that on a larger scale, and they're going to continue trying to understand how their access can be leveraged more than the simpler campaigns of yesteryear, where they'll expand further. And to them, I don't think it matters if they're going to do extortion or ransomware or something else. I have a feeling they'll find creative ways to make it painful for everyone else, but really in the pursuit of money making for themselves, is making as much money as they can. And they're getting really, really good at it, really fast, much more advanced than before, much faster.
So if I can take the liberty, perhaps we can segue into my segment here, because I think it really does blend in with what you were talking about, Stan. And my prediction here is that we'll see increased extortion attacks in 2021. And in particular, ransomware, I fit into that category. That is, you're really extorting somebody for basically restoral of their data. But I also see DDoS attacks in that category. And not only have we seen a significant increase in the number of extortion attacks, but we've also seen extortion demands increasing significantly. And so, Stan, you had actually pointed out that what they've done is, rather than infect an end user's PC, perhaps through malicious email, they're digging deeper into organizations, getting to the servers. They may be actually going through remote access methods. RDP is often exploited to be able to gain access into data centers. If you can encrypt a data center, that's certainly going to be much more impactful to an organization than just impacting an end user's PC, for example. So we certainly are seeing this type of activity. So we've already seen the increases. I expect those increases to continue into 2021. And I've got a couple of articles cited here. One from Akamai, one from Radware. Now, Radware is in business, actually both Akamai and Radware are in the business of mitigating attacks. AT&T also has an attack mitigation service. I can certainly say that we have observed many more DDoS attacks against customers than we've seen in the past. And this is a case where, and I'm referring more specifically to business customers, where they are being extorted for money. And part of the reason is that DDoS attacks have actually become much less expensive to do. So there is a technology facet behind this, but I wanted to share actually another sort of perspective here, is that I think a lot of this is really driven by economics, and that most of the payments are requested in Bitcoin. And if we look at the observation, this is actually showing the value of Bitcoin over the last year. Bitcoin is actually almost at its all-time high value over its entire lifetime. In 2017, there was a spike. And in fact, in 2017, when that spiked, we saw an increase in extortion attacks. It seemed to level off as the value of Bitcoin dropped. But now as it's climbing again, it seems like there's a corresponding, I don't know if I'd call it a linear ratio, but there's certainly a growth and the amount of extortion-type attack activity that's taking place. In addition to the value, that is, if they can demand value and it becomes a good investment, certainly the attackers gain from the investment value of Bitcoin that they gain. But there's also the fact that cryptocurrency transactions are difficult to track. So long as there's a high-value currency that they can use that's difficult to track and trace down and maintain their anonymity, it certainly is valuable for the criminals. So that's the economics angle of this. And then if we look at the, just the technology aspect of it, as I mentioned, there is a commercialized DDoS attack service capability that exists. That's been around for quite some time. It's actually mostly fueled by video gamers. But because it's fueled and it's available, it makes actually that capability less expensive and more available to attackers that might want to conduct extortion type of attacks. So that's a technology aspect of this. And then in the ransomware space, Stan, you touched on this a little bit. That technology is evolving and becoming more automated. That is, it used to be that the attacker basically got the one computer they got to, Now they've got self-propagating software that goes predominantly across Windows platforms, lateral movement capabilities that have been added to it, and certainly more automation in the process of being able to basically conduct the transactions that are taking place here. And then, so as we go forward, I think I have a couple of recommendations here that folks should be taking a look at. First of all, avoid paying the ransom if possible. Even if you are a victim, you want to try to not fuel this criminal activity. So if you can find an alternative path, that's certainly in your best interest. And then, establish a DDoS mitigation service in advance. It is possible to provision services in an emergency situation, but it's going to go in the order of certainly minutes, if not hours. You'd like to be able to get into a position where you can mitigate attacks in seconds and actually have some confidence in the way it's provisioned and the way it works for you. So perhaps doing some tests in advance so you're comfortable with that capability and aren't tempted to pay ransom in a DDoS attack extortion case. And then in terms of protecting against ransomware, certainly vulnerability patching is going to help. Endpoint protection, make sure you don't have loose remote access capabilities. And then last but not least, backups. And one last comment here, and this again, Stan, I think is feeding into your comments earlier. Watch out for that ransomware that's migrating to the Linux environments. I think we've seen most of the cases have been targeting Windows environments, but there's this ransom EXX that is basically demonstrating that it's going after, it's actually one that started out in the Windows space and is evolving into Linux space, not very automated yet, but there are lots of opportunities for being able to basically spread and perform other types of activities that would make it much more difficult to protect against. So I happen to have referenced an article here from Forbes that talks a little bit about that particular form of ransomware that's worth having some insight into.
You thought, Brian, I mean, one of the things I know you talked about DDoS, and it strikes me as, and ransomware, when we talk about social media and whatever, I keep thinking of, I could go to a company and say, if you don't pay me, I'll attack you there even, I'll attack you, through these common mechanisms that get spread very rapidly sometimes. And I wonder if we'll start seeing something like that occur as well, that, you either pay me X Bitcoin or I'm going to post something negative that will get carried, across all the little social platforms.
So, John, one of the things that you just sort of reminded me about is these cases where there has been extortion attacks that have been conducted, but there's really has been no intent to actually conduct attacks, where it seems that more recently the attackers have actually had the capability and the intent to conduct the attacks and have demonstrated that. We've seen that many times in the past where, somebody would send a letter and say, we're going to DDoS attack you if you don't pay. And if you didn't pay, nothing would happen. But it seems like lately they are willing to conduct those attacks. And, certainly in many cases, if you have a mitigation service, you're probably really well protected against those attacks. But it certainly is good to be prepared for those in either case. Okay, John, so I think you have a prediction of something around, obviously, a very hot topic in the technology space, our transition to 5G technology. And, obviously, we need to be paying attention to what's going on in that space, how it gets used, and what types of issues might come up. So tell us a little bit about your point of view.
Yeah, and I want to, preface all of this by saying that, 5G itself is a very secure technology. I mean, that's something that people need to understand, and we understand ourselves. The challenge here is really the interconnectivity. So you have to think 5G still has to talk to your LTEs, and in some environments, not necessarily ours, but in 2G even. I mean, we got to go back to old equipment, old connectivity, old devices. So you have to think that interconnectivity, especially past the what we call the RAN, the radio tower itself, becomes this whole challenge of this, I don't want to say miasma, but this whole interconnectivity bubble that happens between here's going here, here, here. So when you're talking 5G only, it's a great environment, very secure-minded, designed perfectly with that concept. But it's that, how do I connect into it? And not only that, but how do I implement it? There's a lot of vendors and a lot of specs that have to be done with 5G. And so a vendor who implements something a little different than another one might be more at a risk. And it's that evolution of this whole 5G world that we're all going to live in for a long time now, hopefully. I keep hearing 6G now touted, but still, it's this evolution of 5G and even the virtualization. We have components in 5G that are being virtualized in the future. So they're physical hardware now, physical hardware, maybe even an LTE or older technologies. Now we're going to virtualize them. We're going to change that all out. And we have to think that those are changes and interconnectivity that is often ripe for someone to look at and think, how can I not actually attack 5G itself, but how can I attack that connection between the 5G environment and this legacy device, or this 5G environment talking to a legacy environment? And I really think that we're going to start seeing that type of attack and that type of vulnerabilities be found and perhaps even exploited in the next year or two.
Yeah. So, John, I think I heard three kinds of things here that we could probably break down a little bit further, and help me if I'm translating this correctly, because I might not have it quite correct. But first, you talked a little bit about connectivity, and this is what I tend to think of in terms of how you use, I'll say just even generally, mobility technology and how it's applied. And one of the big, up and coming activities around 5G is really a revolution in how mobility services are used. We had talked a little bit earlier. We've really enjoyed the benefit of having essentially two vendors or two sets of technologies providing most of the handsets that are in the mobility world today. Basically, Apple being one, and Google Android being basically the basis of another. Yeah. And there certainly have been other devices, Stan, quite well about some of the 3G modems that have caused a lot of issues. And that's, I think, really inherently where we need to be paying attention is we're having new vendors, new products, a plethora of new products being introduced. And because of those new products, there are probably going to be new types of issues that are going to pop up that we need to be watching out for and make sure that we're protected against, not just as a network service provider, but also end users protecting themselves and the data that's being processed in those systems. So connectivity interpretation.
You're right. Yeah, you're right. And you think about there's going to be more and more companies wanting to connect. And so a lot of these companies are going to be new. They may not think of things with security in mind. And we just have to be aware that, we have a very secure environment and we have potentially unknown entity connecting to it. So let's make sure that entity understands what they have to do to be secure.
Yes, absolutely. So the second category that I heard was around standards. And the way I tend to think of 5G is that it really is an evolution. I mean, it's a generation. G stands for generation. And it's a fifth generation technology, where the first generation was analog. 2G was sort of the beginning of the digital thing. They got a few things right. 3G was certainly an improvement on that. 4G's been pretty darn good. But 5G is yet another evolution in the standards. Improvements in the encryption, where encryption is performed, where security functions are applied, and it's part of the standards infrastructure that the vendors are implementing to be able to help facilitate that 5G stuff. So I generally seen an improvement in that space. There have been very few problems in the past, but where we have identified problems associated with these standards, we've been improving in the next generation of standards. So, did I get that one right?
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. We're not going backwards, right? We're moving forwards, and security is, and 5G was implemented and designed. I shouldn't say implemented, but it was certainly designed with security as a foremost effort, part of it. So yes, you got it right.
I think the third thing that I heard was the infrastructure, and what I would tend to think of is, you mentioned, John, the virtualization, and I see the virtualization actually as an enhancer from a security standpoint. It gives us the opportunity to automate the security in a much better way. And I think back, years ago, where you had a person having to administer each of the instances of a server and, in many cases, application or appliances. We have the opportunity to automate that. And if there is a security problem identified, to be able to make it the corrections much more pervasively, much more quickly than was ever possible in the past. And just as an example, we have a project that we call Astra, where we use that to basically monitor the security posture of our virtualized workloads and give us insight into what the security posture is and be able to actually correct those automatically very quickly. That really is an enhancement from a security standpoint.
Yeah, and I think you clarified something that maybe I wasn't real clear on. Is virtualization itself is not a security problem. Virtualization is a security pro. I mean, that's a good thing to happen. It's the challenge there is now we're talking changes. Anytime you make changes, we're human. People make mistakes. And I think that, and there's going to be somebody who will observe that. And we just got to make sure that we're doing it right. And I think we will, but it's going to take a little bit of learning, unfortunately, along the way.
One of the things that resonates with me as you guys talk about deploying new technology is like another prediction I've been thinking about having to do with deployment of like multi-factor authentication. And I think whenever you deploy a new technology, there's an opportunity to get a lot of it right because you're doing it for the right reasons. It's more secure, it's designed correctly. But sometimes, I think, John, you mentioned this, we're human, and humans sometimes make mistakes in the implementation. This is what the adversaries look for. So one of the things we've been seeing is there's been a lot of brute forcing activity always. But I feel like next year is just going to increase much more, and it's going to reach some sort of like this boiling point, I call it. I don't know if it's going to happen next year, but definitely within the next 5 years, where I think it'll cause a lot of people to actually start adopting MFA, multi-factor authentication, through like authentication apps and other ways to accomplish that. But I think, just to your point about deploying new technology, there's probably going to be some mistakes made. And, I even think about like when you set up your identity for the very first time, how does that work? How do you recover your key? And there are ways to do that. And then I wonder, how do people manage those ways? And those could be insecure. So just some ideas that are very similar to what you're saying with rollouts of new technology. Just kind of resonated with me as well.
Human factors come into play, for sure.
Absolutely. Stan, I think you're absolutely right about that. And, sometimes, actually one of my little pet peeves has been that when you start with something, the policy is as good as it will probably ever be. If you think about designing of a system or something like that, somebody will start out, this is firewall policy. It's very simple. You have web access here, you have administrative access there, and the next thing you know, there's 30,000 holes put in the firewall. I think that's true in the multi-factor authentication evolution that's occurred as well. And when some of the current, I'll say, mainstream multi-factor authentication solutions were created, they were very well laid out in many respects, in that they had a physical hardware token associated with it, and then there was there really was a two-factor concept around it. Some of the more recent things where you have a software token that's actually built into the browser, the same machine that you're authenticating from actually bypasses that. And then there are other factors where, invariably we like to think that people are relatively resistant to social engineering, but ultimately a well-crafted social engineering attack will find victims. They may not be successful in everybody, but they will find somebody where they're successful. And so it's that kind of thing where I think you're absolutely right that there will need to be an evolution in multi-factor authentication technology. I'm going to take this as an opportunity for a shameless plug. We think we have a solution with Zenki. If you want to take a look at it, myzenki.com. But that's a opportunity to be able to really, I think, harden multi-factor authentication capabilities and bring that to the mainstream and really improve authentication capabilities with less friction for the end user. And I think that's the sort of the art of doing it properly. That is, multi-factor authentication has generally been a source of friction in the past that makes it more difficult to access applications. You want to get to a position where you get both less friction and more security. Okay, so let me see if I can summarize here. Stan, you were saying that that basically cybercrime is going to really grow in sophistication. I think what you were suggesting is perhaps it's a little bit competitive with the what we've traditionally associated with advanced persistent threats, nation-state attackers. Is that right?
Yes, exactly right, Brian.
Okay. I talked about that whole concept, and then extortion attacks being a growth area, DDoS attacks and ransomware attacks. I expect that to evolve from a technology standpoint, but I also see the economics as part of a driver. That is, if you can demand a ransom and actually have a good investment associated with that ransom, that obviously is attractive for these cyber criminals that are performing activities. John, you talked a little bit about the 5G and the evolution and where we need to, whereas 5G really is an improvement from a security standpoint, we need to be paying attention in particular because it's a growth and how the network gets used and who is using it, and need to be paying attention to how that might turn into security problems. So we're paying attention to that activity, right?
That's correct. I'm optimistic, but we just need to be vigilant.
Okay. And then, Stan, you've also tagged on another prediction related to multi-factor authentication and the evolution of technology here. And, of course, I use that as an opportunity for a shameless plug. I think Zenki really has a good opportunity to help replace some of the issues and correct some of the issues and replace some of the technology that's in place. But to your point, anytime we have new technology, we need to be mindful of the problems that might come up, and make sure that we're on top of the corrections associated with it.
Yes, I think it's fair to say next year is going to be more complicated than the year before. And we, as always, have to remain vigilant, help secure our networks, and we hope that everyone else does the same.
Okay, well, that's our predictions for 2021. We welcome your comments, your feedback, and questions.